The king is dead. The king is dead. The king is dead. In ancient times, if you carried this message, it either meant you were going to get a bounty or a gift, or your life would be taken away. Because when a messenger came with such a message and they announced it to those who were receiving this message, if they were the enemies of the king, they rejoiced. But if they were the servants of the king, they would have had anger and would have destroyed the life of the messenger. Well, I have the privilege to announce that over the past 37 years in the nation of Zimbabwe, we had a man called Robert Mugabe. And Robert Mugabe was the president of this great nation. And he ruled it from 1980 to 2017. And a life fully lived, purpose fulfilled. And I believe that as I look at this message, the king is dead, I believe I would like to start a conversation that is relevant for Zimbabwe. I'd like to start a conversation that's relevant for Southern Africa, for the African continent, but I believe it's also relevant for global leaders. When a king dies, it's the sign of the end of a dispensation. When a king dies, it's an issue of, has he left a legacy or has he left a tragedy? And I believe that there is no king that you can actually look at and you cannot draw lessons. The Bible says at the end of the book of Samuel that King Saul had died. And as the message is given to King David, one of the things David asks, and he begins to respond to this message, is how did King Saul die? And as David begins to respond on this message, he comes out of the sonnet and a poem, and he says how the mighty have fallen. Whether a king has ruled for 1 year or he has ruled for 40 years, how the mighty have fallen. And I believe as we analyze the life of Robert Mugabe, I believe there are so many treasures and lessons that African leaders need to reflect on. Not just African leaders, but wherever you're sitting right now, you need to study the life of a man who lived and who died and who influenced the lives of so many people. Was it a tragedy? Was it a legacy? I'd like to start with the fact that I think when I look at the life of Robert Mugabe, I think he carried both. And I'd like to start with some of the ingredients of his legacy. You see, when Robert Mugabe lived, one of the things he left behind was the power of liberation leaders. Africa has seen the rise of liberation leaders from the early 1950s all the way up to our current date. We have seen these magnanimous leaders, powerful leaders that led African nations to freedom. And you cannot study the liberation of Africa without talking about Robert Mugabe. And so one of the things we would need to remember is that he was a great liberation hero. The second thing I'd like to talk about when I think about the life of Robert Mugabe, not only was he a great liberation hero, but he was an orator. He inspired the crowd. He was able to stand on national platforms, on regional platforms, on international platforms. And he spoke with elegance, and he exuded what one might even say or call the spirit of leadership. You know, he would speak at global platforms and he would challenge the North, he would challenge the South, he would challenge the East, he would challenge the West, and he would espouse a strong African identity. Indeed, the life of Robert Mugabe. The third thing I'd like to mention is that he had the audacity to take Zimbabwe back to address the land issue. Indeed, the land issue or the land question is a question that many African nations have had to grapple with. And we may not like it or we may not want to hear this, but he was willing to ask that question and to challenge Zimbabwe to look at that issue. And so these are some of the things that I think about when I think about the legacy of Robert Mugabe. In the early 90s, 80s, and all the way into the 90s, Zimbabwe was rated as one of the most literate countries on the continent of Africa. And a lot of it came from the fact that Robert Mugabe loved education and he inspired Zimbabweans to get educated. Indeed, he did leave a legacy. One of the things that I always stand mesmerized about Robert Mugabe is that he was an astute politician. It takes an astute politician to lead a political party for 37 years. Whether we like it or not, he had that ability and that capacity to bring people together and to inspire the vision that he inspired. And so indeed, I do see a man who left a legacy. But I also see a man who sometimes I would struggle with, because with every great leader, sometimes comes an aspect of tragedy. One of the tragedies I'd like to talk about, and one of the things we're going to have to reflect on the life of Robert Mugabe, is that he did struggle to handle political opposition. If one would study his life, you will see that in the early 80s, even into the 90s, and certainly into the early 2000s, there was now a clash as opposition political parties began to rise. And there was a sense in which that it probably challenged his fatherhood and his chieftainship. It was almost like, how dare you challenge me? I was the leader that set you free. And so we begin to see that struggle as he is unable to handle the fact that maybe the citizens of Zimbabwe may want to choose another political leader. One of the things that Robert Mugabe happened under his watch was the Gukurahundi massacres in Bulawayo. It happened under his watch. And indeed, these are some of the big issues that we'll have to look at as we look at the legacy, but as we also look at the tragedy. Could he have united the nation in really confronting what happened in the early 80s? Did he have that capacity as the father of the nation to actually say we need to have deep conversations between the two tribes that probably had historical histories of clashing between these two tribes? Indeed, Gukurahundi happened under his watch, and everything rises and falls on leadership. These are some of the tragedies that we see during the reign and life of Robert Mugabe. Another oxymoron or dichotomy was that when he led the land invasion and he decided to give land to the local people, a lot of people will struggle with the way it was done. A lot of life was lost, and it divided the white Zimbabweans versus the black Zimbabweans. And it's almost like we had reverse racism that began to manifest itself in our nation. And so a lot of people would struggle with how it was done. Some might even question why it was done. And so these are some of the dichotomies we have to deal as we look at the life of Robert Mugabe. One more thing I'd like to mention, which is a tragedy, was that he started well, but many would argue that did he finish well? And indeed, the rise to power, but by the end of his life, he was leading a nation that had an economic crisis that continued to spiral politically, not just between ZANU-PF and the opposition parties, but within his own ruling party. There was a melting system there, which eventually ended in him being removed by his own disciples. And so we see the life of a man. I'd like to challenge African leaders today is that we must study the strengths and weaknesses of a leader so that we don't throw away the baby with the dirty water. Because in every leader, not just Robert Mugabe, I look at my life, I have strengths and I have weaknesses. And there are tragedies in my life, there are opportunities that I've missed, there are mistakes that I've made. And we must study leadership without demonizing the person, without throwing away the goodness, the contribution that he made. You know, I'm a student of the Bible. When I look at the Bible, even if a man led for 1 year, they would chronicle his life. They would talk about the high points, and then they'll talk about the low points. And it was meant to be a subjective review, not a personal assault on the life of a man. And I believe what an opportunity for Zimbabwe to study leadership, to say a life lived, a man who had vision, a man who had conviction. We cannot take that away from him. He was a man who was convicted. But ideas have consequences. And so there are some of the Mugabe ideas that we must perpetuate. A strong sense of identity, a sense of we have African values that may clash with Western values. You know, the whole view around lesbianism and homosexuality. There's a huge clash then. How do we address some of those differences and issues? Robert Mugabe definitely espoused an Afrocentric position on some of those issues. And so there are some things we must pass on to the next generation. And we must say, this is a part of the story that we must pass on. But there are some things we must say, you know what? These things must stop. You know, how politics has developed on the African continent, I believe the next generation has an opportunity to do it differently. We don't have to fight over power and actually be divided over political ideology. But we can have different ideologies and still be one great nation. One of the opportunities for current political leaders that are ruling the nation of Zimbabwe right now to say, what can we learn from the life of Robert Gabriel Mugabe? And so I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts from another king. And this king comes from an ancient time. And I draw this lesson from a man called King Asa. If you study the history of the Jewish people, they had many kings. The Bible actually dedicates 6 books to the life of kings. And so kings are important. We must study the life of kings. King Asa is interesting because King Asa did a couple of good things, but he also had some tragedy in his story. One of the things that King Asa did, number one, is that he did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. And what does that mean for you today? Even if you're not a believer or a Christian from a religious background, he did that which was right in the eyes of the law. in the eyes of justice, in the eyes of the common good. He did that which was right. And I believe whether you're a king of a nation, a king of a family, you're a queen, whatever leadership position you hold, are you doing that which is right? And I believe as I look at my life, what will people say when I die? Will they say I did that which was right? And I believe indeed ideas have consequences. Human beings have a conscience. And every day leaders have to make decisions. Are you doing that which is right? Number 2, King Asa removed the high places. It's a very interesting concept. In the Jewish culture, they would worship God, or they worshipped at what was called a high place. But what would happen sometimes is that other kings would come and they would bring idols. Or in other words, they brought perverted ideas around the whole concept of who God was. But when King Asa became king, he removed those high places. I believe a high place is a place of a perverted idea. So for example, racism is a perverted idea. Injustice is it's a high place. Any ideology that brings destruction to a people, that is a high place. And I believe Zimbabweans have an opportunity to identify the high places and to say, you know what, we're going to pull down the high places. Even Western nations have high places, and we need to bring truth to power. We need to bring truth into situations and pull down the high places. The third thing that King Asa did, that he trusted in God. Whenever he fought battles, he did not fight using the arm of flesh, but he would inquire of God, and God would give him a strategy. Can I say this? I believe God is the master strategist. And I believe if leaders would have a level of God dependency, they'll be able to inquire of God when confronted with issues like the land issue. How do you address historical inequalities that go back over 100 years, over 200 years, but still build unity in a nation? I believe such issues need to be addressed, but maybe they require that we inquire of the Lord so that we don't destroy a nation, so that we don't bring racism, but we bring unity in a nation, but yet address real fundamental issues of inequality. The last thing that King Asa did is that he didn't finish well. Isn't that interesting? If you study 1st and 2nd Kings, you study 1st and 2nd Samuel, you study 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it outlines the line of the kings of Judah and the line of the kings of Israel. Israel had no good kings, but Judah had some good kings. And isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting that in the Bible there were many bad kings, and these kings were chronicled? But even the good kings were not perfect. They were men like you and me. They had weaknesses. So King Asa doesn't finish well. And I suppose that's the biggest question that I need to ask. Will I finish well? A wise man once said to me, he said, integrity is character over time. It's not how you start. It's how you finish. The king is dead.